Welcome to the first episode of Running with Science. What I'm hoping to do in this series of podcasts is discuss how recent studies on training and the impacts of training have recently really altered the way that we should be thinking about our training. Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Running with Science. What I'm hoping to do in this series of podcasts is discuss what recent studies are telling us about how we should go about training to improve our health and to race faster. My name's Andre Gilburn. I'm in the Environmental Sustainability and Human Health Research Group at the University of Stirling, which is Scotland's University for Sport. So the aim of these podcasts, well, at the moment, runners are bombarded with all sorts of contradictory information. And the reason that some of that information is contradictory is because studies are actually looking at different things. They're looking at different timescales. They're sometimes only looking at one factor rather than interactions between different components of training, or they're based on a particular cohort of runners, such as elite athletes or people who don't do any exercise at all. So these results can be misleading and are not necessarily applicable to your average recreational runner. That's changing. We've now got massive data sets from apps like Strava. Analysing those data sets has enabled us to come up with some really intriguing outcomes. Outcomes of some of these studies from Strava and other apps, I believe, should be resulting in a paradigm shift in the way we actually think about and understand training. So my aim is to provide a fellow researcher's view on the current state of research into training and what changes people should be making to their training as a result of this research. In this episode, I'm going to talk about one particular article. This came out in November 2024. It's called The Training Intensity Distribution of Marathon Runners Across Performance Levels. They looked at a huge sample size. It was nearly 120,000 runners, and they looked at all runs by those runners for 16 weeks prior to them taking part in a marathon. They separated everybody's runs into 3 zones. I know some of you may be more familiar with a 4-zone or a 5-zone separation. A lot of the scientific studies are using a relatively simple 3-zone denotification of pace related to heart rate. And in the next episode, I'm going to be hopefully explaining to you how to work out what your 3 zones are based upon your own runs on Strava. Now, don't worry if you don't understand these terms. As I said, I'm going to look at them in a future episode. But the way this particular paper defined the different zones was zone 1 is running up to the lactate threshold. Basically means you're running easy and you're not developing lactic acid and starting to get sore muscles. Zone 2 is between the lactate threshold and what's called your critical speed. These are really moderate intense runs. And then we have zone 3, which is where you're running above your individual critical speed, and these are high intensity runs. What did the study discover? Well, the first thing, which wasn't surprising at all, was that people that trained with higher mileage ran faster marathons. No surprise there. What was surprising was that training in zone 1 led to faster times for most athletes. Training in zone 2, on the whole, led to slower times, apart from for the very slowest athletes. and training in zone 3 always led to slower times. So let's have a look at some of the data in more detail. This is a plot of the distance that people ran against their times. So if you look along the bottom of the screen, we've got different half an hour groupings of times, starting from 2 hours to 2.5 hours and going right through to 6 hours to 6.5 hours. And on the left of the screen, on what we call the y-axis, we have the weekly kilometers being run in that 16-week period. So what you can see from this is people in these different groups were typically running at least on average 35 kilometers, even in the slowest groups. As you slowly increase your weekly mileage, so you actually get seemingly quite substantial increases in the speed, the pace you're actually able to run a marathon at. But what you can see from this graph is the curve gets steeper and steeper and steeper as it gets further to the left, which is meaning you've got to run further and further and further disproportionately in order to continue to get gains. And that makes sense because there's a limit to how fast each of us can run. And the closer you get to your natural limit, the harder it is, and the more work you're going to have to do to push further on. In other words, it's easier to get fitter when you're unfit. It's a lot harder to get fitter when you're really fit. Okay, so this is telling us that increasing mileage increases racing times, and that increasing mileage is likely to have the biggest impact in terms of slower runners. Faster runners will probably need to make big increases in mileage to see the benefits from it. Okay, now this looks like quite a complicated plot, but what I want you to do is to just consider the 3 different broad groups of plots for the 3 different zones. So on the top, we have zone 1, and all the zone 1 plots here are showing a similar pattern. The fact there's 4 plots for each zone is because it's the data for different kind of monthly periods or 4-week periods before the race. And interestingly, there's very little evidence of any difference depending on whether you were training 2 weeks before a race or 14 weeks before the race, and what impact different training zones actually had, which is really quite interesting. If we look at zone 2 first, so zone 2 is kind of in the orange. Zone 2 is showing a kind of a peak. It's a hill-shaped curve, which is showing that we're typically seeing about 40% of running in zone 2 by people that are running marathons between about 2 hours and 2.5 hours. It's hinting that because we see an increase in the proportion of zone 2 runs from people who are running 6-hour marathons to about people running 4-hour marathons, that zone 2 running may be good for relatively slow athletes to gain some benefit. If we look at zone 1, which are the curves at the top of the screen, what you can see here is a slight decrease from the very slowest ones to middling athletes, which seems to kind of mirror the effect that's going on in zone 2, where you seem to be doing quite well if you're doing a bit more zone 2 if you're relatively unfit. But the really important thing that we're seeing here with the zone 2 is in the left-hand end of the graph, that we see a big increase in finishing times as athletes are doing a greater proportion of their runs in zone 1. So the most successful marathon runners, the fastest marathon runners, are doing a much greater proportion of their running in zone 1 than slower runners are. And zone 3, it just goes down. the more zone 3 running you do when you're training for a marathon, the slower your marathon is going to be. That's giving a very clear message for high intensity runs, that they are not just not helping, they're actually unhelpful. They're slowing your marathon times. So what's going on here? Well, it seems that zone 1 aids faster times for those that are running at least 5-hour marathons, and it's the key to running really fast times. So training in zone 1 is really important. Zone 2 aids those who are at the moment running the slowest marathons, just to get up to maybe like 4.5 hours, perhaps push towards 4 hours. Zone 3 is just bad for everyone, but it gets progressively worse the faster you get. Okay, let's have a look at finishing time against the percentage of training in zone 1 in a bit more detail. So this is the plot of finishing times against zone 1 training. We can see that those people that did the highest proportion of their training in zone 1, which were people who are doing around 80% of their training in zone 1, who are actually meeting that old 80-20 rule. Interestingly, one of the things you can see from this plot is almost nobody's reaching the 80-20 rule. And those that are reaching it are running the fastest marathons. This is telling us that most runners are training too little of their time in zone 1. If you want to improve your marathon times, the best thing you can do is add more long, slow runs. This is zone 2. The overall plot with zone 2 is that zone 2 is bad, and the more proportion of runs you do in zone 2, the worse your finishing time is likely to be. Although we did see in the other plot that there might be some benefits for the slowest runners. But overall, there's a clear, significant pattern that training in zone 2 is not good for your marathon time. And this one is just astonishing, really quite astonishing. This is the plot between high intensity training, zone 3, and finishing times. And there is an astonishingly strong relationship. It's just a straight line. It's a steep straight line with virtually all the points on it. Basically, every HIIT session you do in the 16 weeks in the run up to a marathon, including 15 weeks previous, is going to negatively impact your running time. The fact that there's no change from whether it's a week before or 15 weeks before really does hint that high intensity training is not just bad for your marathon times, it's probably just bad for your fitness overall. And in a future podcast, I'm going to talk about other studies that are beginning to find evidence that doing too many HIIT sessions is actually probably quite bad for your health. And there is absolutely no evidence here. There is no change in the slope of that line. There is no evidence whatsoever. Even a small amount of HIIT is useful. It is all really bad, however much you do. So I think this is the biggest take-home message, is if you're already a runner, you're already doing training, you're already reasonably fit, and even if you're only running 6-hour marathons, you're still fit enough that you don't need to be doing any HIIT. And if you do HIIT training, it is going to harm your race time. I hope that was useful for folks, and I will see you again soon when I do episode 2. And in episode 2, I forgot to say, I will explain to you how you can calculate your lactate threshold and your critical speed using the methodology that used in this paper, so you can work out what your zones are. Okay, right. It really is bye from me this time. Okay, thanks a lot.